Hi, this is Justin from Reclaiming Christendom. Today, my colleague Gavin will tell you a fascinating tale about Guy Fawkes, the guy from those V Vendetta movie, Edmund Campion, and the plot to erase 1,000 years of English Catholic history. Buckle your seatbelts and listen up.
Hello and welcome. Well, I wanted to give some more thought to the King and the Pope, going by a rather unusual route of Judas and Peter, and ending up by comparing Guy Fawkes and St. Edmund Campion. Because the more I thought about it, the more I'm intrigued and entranced, and I think excited, really, by seeing history in a way I hadn't seen it before. So I'd like to share it with you. Imagine for a moment that we didn't have the Gospels, but before we got the Gospels, Judas, having not killed himself, became the spokesman for the Jesus event. And the Romans and the Sanhedrin, keen to have a propaganda victory of their own, decided they would write up the Jesus event through the eyes of Judas. And most people think, a lot of people think, that one of the things that Judas wanted to do was to engage in a political messiahship for Jesus, one that would throw the Romans out, a kind of Jewish nationalism thing, early Zionism. So let's just accept that hypothetically for the moment. It would be very hard to get a proper view of Jesus through the eyes of Judas as a kind of state patsy. Imagine Josephus had written it up, and that was our main access to the Jesus event. Well, wonderfully, of course, that didn't happen. And we get to know about Jesus through the apostles, who were true and real and honest and utterly convinced eyewitnesses to Jesus and the resurrection. But just imagine what would happen if state propaganda had presented it through the eyes of, well, a mercenary, an unsympathetic mercenary like Judas. Because that's what happened to Catholics in the 16th century in England. Let's go to the King and the Pope for the moment. So this meeting was billed as a profound moment of ecumenical rapprochement. Actually, what really happened was it was midday prayers, not the most profound ecumenical service in the world. And the Pope and the King said Amen about the same time. And that was about it, really. Except that, as people pointed out, this hadn't happened. This was the first time since the Reformation. But that in itself is a piece of disinformation and propaganda, because if you want to know what it was the first time from, if I get my grammar right, it was the first time since, actually, 884, Ethelwulf took little Alfred the Great, aged 4, to meet and pray with Pope Leo IV. And that was the last time a king of England prayed with the Pope. Now, the reason the difference matters is because England hasn't just existed since the Reformation. What this remark did was to obscure 1,000 years of English Catholic history. Actually, more than 1,000 years. I mean, that's counting from 597 to about 1520, 1540, you name your cutoff point. 1540 was the closure of all the monasteries. So let's imagine that for a moment. 1,000 years of English history are just wiped out in this momentary description. But actually, if we're going to go to Edmund Campion, it was that 1,000 years that Saint Edmund Campion wanted to draw the attention of the world to. So we'll let him do that as we come to who he was, and what he stood for, and why they killed him.
Here, Gavin discusses the 1,000 years of missing English Catholic history. You know, all of those fascinating kings, those cool knights and castles, all of that was Catholic in English history. And the Protestant government wanted you to conveniently forget all about that. Let's listen to Gavin.
We have two Catholic men of prominence in the 1500s, well, at the turn of the 1500s to the 1600s, because Guy Fawkes was caught and executed in 1605. And Campion was active and abroad in the 1580s, just before the Spanish Armada. But they're really within about 20, 25 years of each other, quite close. Now, let's compare these two men. The British state was determined to present Catholics as traitors, as people who loved foreign powers more than their own nation, people who wanted to aid and abet the Spanish Armada as it sailed up the Channel, people who preferred the French and French rule just because they were Catholic. They wanted to present Catholicism as foreign and anti-English. They had some difficulty in their plates because it was Catholicism, it was the Catholic Church, it was Catholic Christianity that in those 1,000 or 1,400 years, if you go back to Joseph of Arimathea and the Glastonbury legends, it was Catholic Christianity that provided over 1,000 years of all that was best in English culture. And it's this that was being rubbed out by the Reformation and still is rubbed out and obscured. And we need to bring it back to show the English that you can be Catholic and English. In fact, Catholic Englishness lasted for 1,000 or 1,400 years, and Protestant Englishness has managed about 500 and crashed and wrecked itself. So this is the moment when we need to introduce the English to their heritage. And as we'll discover, and as you'll find in the article that I wrote, where it's all written out very carefully, Edmund Campion made the most moving speech at the point where he was on the scaffold at Tyburn, where he said, being asked to confess to treason and absolutely refusing, he said, as you kill me and reject me, you kill and reject 1,000 years of Catholic England, of Catholic saints, of Catholic knights, of Catholic kings, of Catholic culture, beauty, and truth. That's what you reject when you reject who I am and what I've come to bring you. And that was true. And it matters enormously, which is why we're exploring it now. So let's go to Guy Fawkes. Guy Fawkes was a mercenary. He was a soldier. He was an adventurer. Quite a romantic figure, really, if you like assassins who kill people for money and mix money and other motives. It was who got a group of people together with the intention of blowing up the Houses of Parliament. Now, for the moment, trying not to give way to the excitement of the project of blowing up the Houses of Parliament, because it rather muddies the waters a bit. But let us assume it's an act of political assassination we disapprove of, however much the present behaviour of Parliament attracts us to Guy Fawkes-like instincts. Let's just say no to assassination. The English state, having arrested Guy Fawkes, caught red-handed, trying to blow up Parliament, presented him as the epitome of Catholicism, a traitor, a renegade, a mercenary, an assassin, very anti-English. Actually, there's very good reasons for thinking the whole thing was a false flag thing in the first place, set up by the English state precisely to attract some Catholic hotheads so it could catch them and so it could execute them and mispresent them to the world. There was something called the Babington plot, which had happened just a little bit before, because England in those days was a totalitarian state with a very, very expert and well-oiled spy network run by the Cecils, father and son. Just to give you an example, they knew all about the Guy Fawkes plot at least 10 days before. I mean, as I'm suggesting, they invented it, but let's, even if you don't accept that for a moment, they knew about it 10 days before, and they waited and did absolutely nothing until the very last minute, precisely in order to make the maximum propaganda effect from, look, we've caught them red-handed. Oh my goodness, they nearly did it. Look what they nearly did. Look what we stopped them doing. But I think both the Babington plot and the Gunpowder plot were almost certainly set up by the state. However, make up your own minds about that. Meanwhile, we have this rather reprehensible figure, Guy Fawkes, celebrated by the state, celebrated so much by the state that of all the English civic festivals that got handed down over the next 500 years, Guy Fawkes Night, Bonfire Night, November the 5th, survived in a way that almost nothing else did. Next to Christmas, it was the one event that we all grew up with. So as a young child, I got very excited as November the 5th came. I remember the smell of autumn and the leaves and all the bonfires as we celebrated the execution of the traitor Guy Fawkes and the fact he'd failed to blow up Parliament. We lit sprinklers and set up rockets into the air, little bomb fests to remind us of the excitement of exploding and blowing up your neighbour. And everyone knew that this was a Catholic thing that we had repudiated and were celebrating getting rid of, those dastardly traitors, the Catholics.
We see the Guy Fawkes holiday in November in England, with all those fireworks and fun, was really set up by the Protestant government to say, look at those Catholic traitors. We defeated them. But let Gavin here tell you about the real hero of English Catholic history, which is English history, Edmund Campion. Listen ahead.
The thing is, there was another man who better represented Catholicism, and he was one of the English martyrs. And the thing about the English martyrs is that I made my way to becoming a Catholic partly through stumbling across one of them, or rather the body of one of them. It was St. Robert Southwold. He was killed by the state in the mid-1600s, really quite late on, age 72, for being a Catholic priest who used to carry the sacrament around plague-ridden London, was something of a saint, and was a most extraordinary priest and man. And the state caught him in the 1600s and executed him for being a priest who brought the Mass to Catholics. But before they caught, so it was his body I came across in Westminster Cathedral, where I come to pray. Because everyone knew, you go to London and you want to pray, you don't go into the Anglican places. They are empty of the atmosphere of God. St. Paul's Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, they're tourist spots. But the air is thick in the Catholic Westminster Cathedral because, if only you'd think about it, Jesus is there in the Blessed Sacrament. But people don't think about it. I didn't think about it. I just bumped into the martyrs. So there was this dead man in a coffin right at the West End as you come in. You couldn't help falling over him. And I read about him and went away and read some more and began to be intrigued, and then read some more and read about the martyrs and met Edmund Campion. And I suddenly realized I'd been told a whole load of lies in English history, and I needed to reread it to find out the truth. Campion was a most amazing man. He was a high flyer, an Anglican high flyer, destined for Anglican priesthood and for preferment. He went to Oxford and was one of the cleverest people of his generation and wrote the most beautiful English prose, Shakespeareanly beautiful. We've got a few examples left behind. My goodness, he was good at it. However, at Oxford, he began to become convinced that Catholicism was true. And having done so, he fled to Ireland and then to the continent, via Douai, where he became a Catholic, and then went to Rome, where he became a Jesuit, and set back with a band of friends to bring Jesus in the Mass to the English people, knowing they would kill him, catch him, and execute him as a traitor and spy, when actually he was just an Englishman, become a priest, bringing Jesus in the Mass. Increasingly, I've got to think that this whole episode was all about the English state being determined to keep Jesus in the Mass from the mouths of the people, which begins to make it rather more diabolical than it looks at first sight in the history books. What else was the motivation, or what was the critical focus of the motivation? What was the effect? That was the effect. Campion came back knowing perfectly well that it was in the interests of the state to portray him as a Spanish-loving, French-loving traitor. He wrote himself a sort of passport or a declaration of intent called a brag. And he said, I've come here with no political intentions whatsoever. I pray for the Queen. I'm here just as a priest, bringing Jesus in the sacrament, coming to absolve people from their sins and reconcile them to the church the government has got rid of. It's not political, it's spiritual. Because the government wouldn't hear that, was determined not to hear that. The only way the government could really counter this was by mispresenting the English martyrs as they were to become, as traitors and as people with political ambitions, which they hadn't. Campion was quite extraordinary. It wasn't enough to capture him and kill him. And of course, the way they killed people was to torture them. They hung them. Hanging wasn't good enough for them. They hung, drew, and quartered them. And as I'm sure you probably know, the way that works is you hang them by the neck until they're nearly dead. Then you cut them down. They hit the ground, wounded, hurt, on the verge of death, gasping for air. And just as they're coming round and breathing the air that they desperately needed, the executioner slices their stomach open in the form of a cross and pulls their entrails out and burns them in front of them. And that's how they die. It's designed to be a very, very nasty death indeed. But before they did that to Campion, they decided they would humiliate him, because being the rising star, he had a reputation for being one of the most intelligent people of his generation. And so they needed to crush him in order to end his influence. So what they did was they took him to the Tower of London, and there they racked him and tortured him. And he came out emaciated, wounded, broken arms and hands, to be put in an amphitheatre to debate the best theologians and philosophers the state could produce. And there was a show trial or show gladiatorial amphitheatre of 4 of these encounters, 4 of their best propagandists they put up against Campion. And when it came to the event itself, the propagandists were fully furnished with all the books they needed on tables in front of them. The fathers were open, the Bible was open, all the notes they needed to remember their arguments and the sources they wanted to refer to. And Campion had nothing. Campion had instead just his memory, his wits, his broken arms and broken hands, standing there, racked, tortured, exhausted, ill. So they brought on their best. Campion debated them, and he thrashed them. He refuted them, and he won every single argument. In fact, he did so well that people began to come and listen, and they began to be converted back to the faith. In fact, it was so effective that they only allowed 3 of these to run. They cancelled the 4th one because Campion was too effective a proponent of the Catholic faith. And stopping it there, they then took him to Tyburn, where they executed him. And before he died, he stood on the scaffold and said he prayed for the Queen. He was not here for any political reason, but that he reminded them that in executing and repudiating him, they were repudiating 1,000 years of Catholic saints, of Catholic kings, of Catholic knights, of Catholic culture, of Catholic integrity. 1,000 years of Catholic England they were turning their backs on as they executed him, and then they killed him. Now, the state had to choose between these 2 men, the mercenary and between the saint. And it chose the mercenary to make the emblematic Catholic. And then they locked Catholics out of civil life for 300 years. If you were a Catholic, you couldn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. You couldn't enter the professions. You couldn't enter Parliament. Civic life was inaccessible to you because of the danger that the Catholic Church presented to the Protestant establishment. What if it produced any more Campions? And instead, it presented this mercenary assassin as the emblematic Catholic, Guy Fawkes. Now, this ecumenical service between the Pope and the King, a moment of rapprochement, a moment for healing wounds, a moment for putting the past behind, such as it was, well, can't easily be done. But do you not think it might have begun with a sorry? A sorry for the ways in which the forebears, whom we represent, may have mistreated one another. What might the Pope have said sorry for? I think the Pope might have said sorry for his forebears excommunicating Elizabeth I. It was a mistake. It was the wrong thing to do. Actually, it backfired rather badly on the Catholic community, and it was probably an overreaction and a political mistake. And so it wouldn't have been too difficult for the Pope to say to the King, I'm sorry my predecessor excommunicated your predecessor. I apologize. We didn't behave in the best way possible. And then the king might have said, I'm sorry that for 300 years the English state chose to misrepresent Catholics and to deliberately promote the nefarious mercenary Guy Fawkes and hide and suppress the truth about the extraordinary St. Edmund Campion. We've done you a disservice. We've done the Catholic Church a disservice. Actually, they did Jesus a disservice. So it might have begun with them saying sorry. But at least it's given us the opportunity of making the distinction between Judas and St. Peter, between Guy Fawkes and St. Edmund Campion, between a failing Protestant experiment that's run its course and has run out of steam, and the Catholic Church that Jesus promised would have his presence forever in the sacrament and against which the gates of hell would never prevail. We should make the most of this opportunity and tell the truth.
A whole new way at looking at English history and English Catholic history, which are really one and the same. Now, we'll have more on Reclaiming Christendom next week, so don't forget to subscribe by hitting the subscribe button below. Thank you, and God bless.